Okay, so we're looking at the war in the West. This is a group of the 48th Tennessee Volunteers that were captured in late April of 1860, or in April of 1862, and this picture is taken of them in late April at Camp Douglas, Illinois, which was a notorious Union prison camp that held soldiers that were captured in the West. We're talking about POWs in lesson 10. Some of the battles that we're going to be looking at today. Oh, there it is. Some of the battles we're looking at today. Fort Henry, Fort Donelson. We're going to look at Shiloh. We're going to talk about Perryville. And we're going to talk about Stones River, also known as the Battle of Murfreesboro. So that's going to be our focus. If you have any questions along the way, please let me know. So in the Western Theater, the commander in the Western Theater of the Confederate Army of Mississippi was Albert Sidney Johnston, highly decorated soldier. We talked about his record all the way back to the Texas Revolution, fought in pretty much any combat from the Texas Revolution to the American Civil War. He's going to be in command of forces from Arkansas to the Cumberland Gap. They're spread out over a pretty thin defensive line. So his left flank is under the command of the fighting bishop, General Leonidas Polk, the guy that was a bishop from Louisiana. He actually went to seminary in Richmond at the Virginia Seminary. Hey, thank you much. And then General Simon Bolivar Buckner, he is going to be in command of the. Here you go. And here you go. He's going to be in command of the right flank. He's a West Pointer and friend of Grant's from before the war. His command is Bowling Green, Kentucky, with about 4,000 men. He is a Kentuckian, and we'll talk a little bit more about his role in 1862 and in the war as well. So the center of this particular these forces consisted of two river forts in Tennessee, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. So here on the left we got Albert Sidney Johnston, in the middle Leonidas Polk, the fighting bishop, and on the right there Simon Bolivar Buckner. Because he was a bishop. That's his papal robe. And anybody heard of Sewanee, prestigious private school down in Tennessee? Have you ever heard that? No, he was a legit bishop. He went to seminary in Richmond, the Virginia Seminary, and then he goes on to become a bishop in Louisiana.
I'm sure you told us, but I just don't remember.
Oh, that's all good. Sewanee College has a sort of a ode to Pope, to Leonidas Polk, the fighting bishops as their mascot, and they've got his military uniform on display. Just thought I would share that.
Is that his military uniform?
No, he actually wore a military uniform in combat.
Okay.
All right, so let's look at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. Both were ordered to be built by the governor of Tennessee in 1861. Governor Harris wanted to defend the Tennessee River with Fort Henry and the Cumberland River with Fort Donelson. These are strategic forts, obviously strategic rivers for the movement of people and supplies. Designed to stop traffic on the Tennessee, not to withstand infantry assaults at Fort Henry. 17 guns were mounted by the time of the battle, 11 covering the river, 6 positioned against a land attack, heavy rains caused the river to rise. This fort was underwater much of the time and was underwater during when the attack occurred in February. The fort was only in commission from 62 to 65. Fort Donelson, 12 miles to the east on the Cumberland River. Grant is going to set up an invasion force on Fort Henry. So he's going to move his forces from Cairo, Illinois to Paducah, Kentucky, and then on to take Fort Henry. About 15,000 men in 2 divisions, 4 ironclad gunboats led by Andrew Hull Foote, and 3 wooden gunboats under Seth Phelps. The fathers of the U.S. river gunboats in the West were James Eads and Samuel Pooke. They actually called Pooke's gunboats Pooke's Turtles because they were heavily submerged. On the left here, we've got Andrew Hull Foote. On the right, Seth Phelps.
What was up with them having sideburns, but like not a beard?
A lot of people rock the
Like they only shave their chin. Looks like he's trying to make his face
unique
look
facial
better.
hair. That's where we get the word sideburns from. It's from Burnside. Yeah.
Yeah,
Looks like his
I
face
guess
is
I was
like trying to have a
Burnside
burn.
has some wacky.
No, but
I've always thought I should rock the Burnside at some
No.
point. Just
You
to-
Please, no.
you know what? Do it.
Maybe
Do it
I'll
for
do it for a
Halloween.
day.
Yeah.
Do it for Halloween and shave it.
Or, maybe January, who knows. All right, so Grant's forces from Cairo to Paducah, and then I'm going to show you those movements. Remember, Halleck is still commander of the Western Department. He has not been brought east yet. So we've got Grant's forces and Foote's forces moving on Fort Henry. So Fort Henry is going to easily fall to the Union Navy. Again, it's swamped. The Confederates are going to abandon the fort and move 12 miles east to Donelson. Foote's ironclads began bombardment on February 6th. The battle lasted about 75 minutes, pretty quick battle. About 2,500 Confederate defenders escaped to Fort Donelson. 2 days later, Fort Henry was underwater. Grant was now between Columbus and Bowling Green, Kentucky. And an important factor here is that now, through the state of Tennessee, the Union has control of the Cumberland, not only in Kentucky, but now in the volunteer state. All right. So, if you follow along here, so Grant's going to control the Tennessee from Kentucky through Tennessee. This is the river, Fort Henry, and then if we move to the Cumberland, Fort Donelson. Here are your gunboats, Lexington, Conestoga, the Tyler, which is a little ironic because I don't know if you all realize this, but John Tyler ended up going with the Confederacy. He's our only American president that's considered a traitor. He ends up becoming a Confederate politician from Virginia, former president of the United States. The Essex, the Coeur d'Alene, the Cincinnati, and then this is Foote's flagship, the St. Louis. All right, so on to Donelson. Donelson was built much tougher than Henry. It was 100 foot above dry ground. There were 3 miles of trenches around the fort. The artillery guarded the river. The commander at Donelson was John B. Floyd. We've already talked about Floyd, former governor of Virginia. He had served under James Buchanan's cabinet as Secretary of War. Remember, he got into some trouble. Does anybody remember what he got into trouble for before he resigned as Secretary of Treasury? and went with the Confederacy. It's a really shady deal that occurred prior to the start of the war. When South Carolina and the other Confederate states started to secede, Floyd sent a bunch of cannons from Pittsburgh to St. Louis, so they would fall into Confederate hands, assuming that the Confederates would hold the arsenal at St. Louis. But we already know the Confederates lost the arsenal at St. Louis to what guy? Nathaniel who? Lyon. Very good. Nice job. All right. Good work, guys. So, he's what we would call a political general, political appointee. He had lost those early battles. Remember the Gallipoli races in West Virginia or Western Virginia, and he was a wanted man in the North for graft. He was really worried about being captured as a prisoner of war, because what happens if an officer is captured? Not really. It's actually a little bit. It's a little bit.
You're going to try to get information from them.
They're going to try to get intel, but officers are a little bit of an interesting case in the Civil War. They bargain for what? They actually bargain to get back other officers. So if an officer is captured, they're not put in the typical, they're usually not put in a typical prisoner of war camp. They're actually put in an officer's camp, and they bargain to trade officers back and forth. So that happened throughout the war. So you might have like a horrible camp like Andersonville, Georgia, or did you all realize that Belle Isle in Richmond was a prison camp? But that's not where officers were kept. Some lower ranking officers, high ranking officers were typically kept in prison camps in, for the Union prison camp where a lot of officers were kept were in Boston. The Confederate prison camp where a lot of officers were kept was in Richmond. So those prisoner exchanges were common, or officer exchanges were common, but Floyd is fearful that what's going to happen to him. He's not going to be exchanged. And he's actually going to be tried for treason, right? Or tried for corruption. Because his crimes against the United States went before the Confederate States of America. He had done so as a U.S. Secretary of State, or Secretary of War, rather. All right, our other political appointee, General Gideon Pillow. He was a Mexican war vet. He was an Alabama delegate at the Nashville Convention. He was second in command at Donelson, but he was outranked by Floyd. And then the highest ranking brigadier general at the fort was Simon Bolivar Buckner. He was a West Pointer, West Point class of 1844, Mexican war vet, had become friends with Grant through their ties to West Point and through their ties to the Mexican War and service in the West. In fact, Grant was so down on his luck, remember he had to resign due to drunkenness in the West. Buckner actually loaned him money to get back home from California. So they had a pretty close relationship. Buckner goes on to surrender this fort to Grant. He later serves. He's an example. He actually was arrested upon the surrender, locked up in the prison camp, or the officers' quarters in Boston, and he was exchanged for General McCall, Union general, 6 months later. So he's a good example of a prisoner exchange. He later serves under the command of General Kirby Smith in the Trans-Mississippi Theater to the west, later elected 30th governor of Kentucky. His son, Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., will become one of the highest ranking U.S. generals in the Pacific Theater. He actually was the commander of the U.S. forces in the Aleutian Campaign in Alaska. And he's also one of the highest ranking generals to actually die in World War II. So we'll talk about him next semester. So here we have Fort Donelson. So if you're looking to visit Fort Henry on a trip to Tennessee, there are some placards and some areas that you can go to. But if you want to go visit Fort Donelson, there's actually still a fort there. Kind of like if you were to visit Drury's, Fort Darling at Drury's Bluff here in Virginia. We got John B. Floyd on the left, Gideon Pillow in the center, and Simon Bolivar Buckner on the right there. All right, so the dilemma that Albert Sidney Johnston has, his forces are now compromised. He's got Grant in between the two. So they might attack Columbus, Kentucky. They might attack Donelson and threaten Nashville. Nashville, Confederate stronghold, and Confederate state capital. The Union might hit him head on at Bowling Green, Kentucky. Grant is behind. Johnson from the west. Buell is in front of Johnson. Johnston from the east. Buell's Army of the Ohio, 45,000 men, Louisville, Kentucky. So Johnston's going to decide to abandon western Kentucky. He withdraws his forces from Bowling Green, and he will reinforce Fort Donelson. So here we have Ulysses S. Grant on the left, Don Carlos Buell on the right, both West Pointers. All right, so you got a better idea of what Albert Sidney Johnston is doing here. You see the dot on the top right there, that's Bowling Green. He's going to move forces toward Donelson, and Grant is going to move forces on Donelson from Fort Henry. All right, so the advance on Donelson begins on February 11th. There was a delay on movement toward the fort due to some cavalry screens that were led by Nathan Bedford Forrest, who is the key cavalry commander in the West. Remember, he raised his own cavalry force with his own money that he had made from the slave trade along the Mississippi. The United States and Confederate siege lines were set up around the fort. One gunboat tested the fort's defenses, and on February 13th, there were some small attacks against the Confederate defenses, casualties but no real results. Temperatures dropped to 10 degrees, so that sort of dismissed the idea that there wasn't going to be winter fighting in the Civil War. On the next day, on the 14th, Foote's flotilla arrived, bringing 6 gunboats and another 10,000 Union reinforcements, and Grant ordered Foote's flotilla of river gunboats to bombard the fort. The Confederate guns returned fire. This inflicted heavy damage on Foote's flotilla. Foote was actually wounded. He was shot in the foot, ironically enough. His flagship, the St. Louis, lost its wheelhouse and just floated downriver on the Cumberland. 2 other gunboats were disabled, and the Union still controlled the Cumberland, but the Confederate Navy was pretty much hopeless against these Union ironclads. On land, Grant prepared siege to encircle the fort, and on the 14th, Confederates attempted a breakout. Pillow led the breakout, but Foote's boats were within just a couple hundred yards of attack. So here we have Grant siege lines. Here we have the Cumberland River. here we have Buckner's defensive line, Pillow's defensive line, and what we're going to see is an abandonment of the fort. You can see how close the gunboats are to the fort. So Fort Donelson falls to Grant's forces after 2 hours of heavy fighting. Grant opens up an assault. Confederates open up an escape route. Pillow orders his men to fall back to regroup. Grant is going to order Andrew Foote to start shelling the fort. Organizes a counterattack on the right against Buckner's men and orders an attack on the forces of Pillow's men that had fallen back. By nightfall, the fort is they're going to decide to surrender the fort. Both Pillow and Floyd will escape, and Buckner will stay back to surrender. Buckner thinks that Grant's going to give him a more conditional surrender, considering their relationship prior to the war. The escape route is also not only taken by Floyd, Pillow, Buckner stays back, but also by Nathan Bedford Forrest and his cavalry. They'll ford the river that will flood behind them, and this particular battle, obviously quite lopsided. I should have written here missing, killed, wounded, so that should be not just killed, missing, killed, wounded. Lopsided results here, Union to Confederate. Now the Union controls not only the Cumberland and the Tennessee rivers, but they also will attack and take Nashville. Nashville is going to be the first Confederate capital to fall to the Union. I want you to make note of that, please. First Confederate capital to fall to the Union is going to be Nashville. So this is a little placard, the withdrawal from Donelson, February 16th, 1862. Just tells you this is the placard for Nathan Bedford Forrest's regiment fording the river that will ultimately become flooded.
How's it flooded?
Heavy rains in February had led to the flooding. Yeah, water levels.
So I guess it was just a coincidence to flood it right after.
Yeah, keep in mind, this is no Tennessee Valley Authority yet, right? Tremendous problem with the flooding of the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers. Remember when we talked about the New Deal last year, the hydroelectric, dams that were built in Tennessee to not only provide energy but prevent flooding. That was a constant problem for Tennesseans during this particular time. So this is where Grant gets the name Unconditional Surrender Grant. Grant is going to capture more soldiers than all previous American generals combined, promoted to Major General following the victory at Fort Henry and Donelson. Opened up 2 great rivers as avenues of invasion into the heartland of the South. Has the ability to now capture Nashville, which will provide crippling results for Confederate supply and morale. Buckner requested terms of surrender. Grant famously says, "No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works," meaning the fort. And here we have Grant on the right. And then we've got the Union, in this image, the Union invasion of the fort. Let's move on to Shiloh in Pittsburgh, at Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River, just south of Tennessee in Mississippi. April 6th through 7th, Grant moved the Army of West Tennessee up the Tennessee River to Pittsburgh Landing. He's waiting for Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio to catch up for reinforcements. The battle actually gets its name. Please take note of this real quick. So heads up. Gets its name from a small church that sat outside of Pittsburgh Landing, Shiloh Church. So it stood near the battlefield. Albert Sidney Johnston, with counsel from PGT Beauregard, decides to concentrate about 55,000 men around Corinth, Mississippi, just south of Tennessee. On April 3rd, he moves about 44,000 men to attack, joined by PGT Beauregard, who had been sent to the west from the east. They moved slow because they had a lot of green soldiers. A lot of the guys were sick too, sick before and sick after this battle. Big problem with Henry, Donelson, and Shiloh. Soldiers who had gone into war had gotten rid of their extra gear that they didn't think they needed. So when the war went into a winter war, these soldiers were suffering from just absolutely brutal weather at Henry, Donelson, and at Shiloh. Surprise attack was led by Johnston on Grant before Buell arrived to join forces. Johnston's plan: attack Grant's left, separate the Union Army from its gunboat support, led by Foote on the Tennessee. And he famously said to Beauregard, "I will attack if there are 1,000,000." On the night, because Beauregard's a little apprehensive about leading this attack. On the night of April 5th, Johnston bivouacked his troops in order of battle, and Johnston is just 2 miles away from Union camps. Encampment is a bivouac. So, kind of interesting about this battle. Interesting thing about this battle: cavalry scouts and some Union generals received intel that the Confederates were on the move and they were going to attack, but the Union didn't believe it. In fact, Sherman didn't believe it. He said, Johnston and Beauregard are not so crazy as to attack us in this position, and they're going to do it. So it caught everybody by surprise. One person in particular would be Sherman, because by the end of the first day of the fighting, Sherman's headquarters is going to be taken over by PGT Beauregard, and that's where Beauregard will sleep in Sherman's bed after the first night of the Battle of Shiloh. So I want to take a look at the map here. So we see where we've got Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, and here's Shiloh, right on the border of Tennessee and Mississippi. So here's Corinth, Mississippi, along the Tennessee River. Shiloh, just north of the Mississippi line here in Tennessee. Anybody ever visited Shiloh? All right, that's actually on my bucket list. I'd like to try to get out there and visit at some point. So Johnston attacks the morning of April 6th. Insufficient forces on the Confederate right. Corps commanders attacked in lines without reserves. It became a massive frontal assault. Insufficient strength to break through. Union command obviously caught by surprise. No defensive fortifications. Patrols provided early warning, but no one believed that the Confederates would actually attack. I like what Sherman said here when a reconnaissance came to him to report that the Confederates were going to attack. He said, "Take your damn regiment back to Ohio. Beauregard is not such a fool as to leave his base of operations and attack us in ours. There is no enemy nearer than Corinth, Mississippi." The Union was pushed back to the Tennessee River at Pittsburgh Landing. They held the line called the Hornet's Nest, which Gavin had researched earlier on April 6th. Johnston was hit in the leg by a stray bullet, and he bled out in his boot by 2:30 in the afternoon. Highest ranking general to die on either side in the entire war. Gave Grant time to set up a defensive line along Pittsburgh Landing, and Beauregard takes over command, orders 62 Confederate cannons to blast the Union center to try to break the lines. So if you follow along here, we've got on the first day, Confederate forces push the Union to Pittsburgh Landing. What they're waiting on is reinforcements from Buell. Now, this is another interesting thing. The reason that I talked about Nathan Bedford Forrest and his cavalry managing to escape Donelson, that's going to be kind of important in this battle because they're actually going to ride into, they're going to take Union uniforms and they're going to put Union uniforms on after the first night. They're going to go behind enemy lines and report back to the Confederacy that Buell is providing reinforcements. The problem was they couldn't find Beauregard and they couldn't find a high enough ranking general to either launch an attack or retreat and fall back to Corinth. So all of the reconnaissance that Forrest's cavalry provided was for nothing because they couldn't get anyone to listen. So it was like a similar situation that Union cavalry faced at the start of the battle on the 6th. So we got the Confederate attack. Union is pushed back to the Tennessee. Here we have the Hornet's Nest, also known as the Sunken Road. This is a reenactment at the Hornet's Nest. And then we have sort of what happens here is that the reinforcements arrive. The defensive line at Pittsburgh Landing was unbroken. Grant was in good position to get help from Buell. Buell's army arrives in the night, and soldier after soldier just gets unloaded at the landing to reinforce Grant. On the 7th, Beauregard took over for Johnston, planned to continue the attack to drive Grant into the river, unaware that the Union had been reinforced, even though Forrest was trying to get that intel to Beauregard. Union forces started attacking at dawn. By 10 a.m., the Union attack was occurring in concert along the entire line. Gunboats firing on the Confederate line included 25,000 fresh troops, thanks to Buell. Beauregard knew he couldn't really go any further. The Confederates had lost the initiative. They're low on ammunition and food. It rained all night long, so the roads were just a muddy mess. 15,000 men were killed, missing, or wounded. By the end of that day on the Confederate side, to this point in the war, Shiloh had been the bloodiest battle. By the end of the war, it would rank 7th of the one of the bloodiest two-day battles, or bloodiest events of the war. They'll withdraw to Shiloh Church and began marching back toward Corinth, Mississippi. Union soldiers did not pursue for a couple of reasons. They were worn out, and it had been 2 brutal days of fighting. So those are the troop movements of them falling back. Sherman pursued the retreating Confederates, met resistance from Forrest's cavalry screen, abandoned the pursuit. It's kind of a famous moment in Forrest's career where Forrest will ride into Union forces, firing his weapon, and then takes a Union soldier and throws him on the back of his horse to use as a human shield as he rides out of the battle.
That's stupid because then the Union soldier could just beat him up on the horse.
This is the guy that Forrest was. He was a absolute lunatic in battle.
It was just kind of like, I'm
the
gonna
Union
do
soldier,
it.
what the Union soldier just
I mean,
punched him.
sure, Forrest had like 30-some horses shot from under him in this war. I mean, it's
That's a
like
lot of horses.
it's like 31 to 33 horses were shot underneath him.
What
How
happened to the
did-
Union
It's a miracle that he wasn't caught.
How does this,
What happened to the
did you
Union
just
soldier?
stand up on a horse?
Let's take a look. I don't know if he was shot in the back, and I know he was thrown off the horse, but I don't know if he was shot. We'll take a look at that. Again, by the end of the 2 days of Shiloh, 23,746 on both sides, missing, killed, wounded. All right, so this is a good place for us to pump the brakes. We will continue our lesson